We got Gators Breakdown here. We know we're business.
Gators Breakdown, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on social media at GatorDave_SEC. And it is time to continue our spring football talk. And we're bringing in Will Miles. Well, I say that if I can sit here and figure out this new system. There we go. Hey, I told y'all it was gonna be a bumpy road the first couple of episodes, getting used to the new streaming platform. There is Will Miles. If you weren't watching the video version, you didn't even know anything was going wrong. But here we are. Video version, and still working out some bumps. Will, welcome to the, not really a new look Gators Breakdown, but a new behind-the-scenes look for Gators Breakdown. You hopped in, you were like, hey, this looks a little different.
Hey, man, you got to upgrade during the off-season. That way we don't have the hiccups when the season actually hits, right? This is our spring practice, too, where we try different things and new toys and all that sort of stuff. So, hope springs eternal, whether it's the Gators Breakdown podcast or Gators Spring Practice. And I look forward to talking about all the lies that we always hear every March and every April.
Maybe they're not lies this year, Will. Maybe they're not lies this year.
Well, we shall see. I mean, I've never been accused of being somebody who's overly optimistic. So, I think there's a healthy dose of skepticism among some fans who, it's time to prove it. Obviously, Florida enjoying the run that the basketball team's going on right now with a team that I think everybody expected to be pretty good but didn't expect to be this good.
Right.
And I think everybody sort of hopes that's what we see from the football team as well this year, is a team we all expect to be good, but do we really expect it to be that good? There's an opportunity for him to get there, and obviously that would be a big deal for Napier, a big deal for the program. And so this is where it starts, right? I mean, you say this to my kids all the time when they're practicing. Is you practice you play the way you practice. At least that's the BS that we feed all of our kids when we're out there coaching them, because we want them to pay attention during practice. But obviously that's true, right? And especially considering that Florida, I think, has quite a bit of talent coming back. But the question is, in a few spaces, who's going to step into those roles where there have been some departures? And then obviously what happens in the case of an injury. And so understanding exactly what they have behind the guys who are going to start. So, are we going to see a lot of Tyreek Sapp this spring? Are they going to put him out there during the spring game? No. But it's important to know who's backing him up, who's able to take that position, who's going to help keep him fresh. Because we talked about this a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. He only played 416 snaps last year, which is a little bit more than half of what the defense saw over the course of the entire year. And so, you need someone to occupy those other snaps as well. And so who are those guys going to be? And, we'll get into Lagway a little bit as well. Obviously, if he misses any sort of time, who's going to get those reps? So those are the kinds of things I think we need to be looking for, and the things that at least I'm sure that Napier and his staff are looking for here out of spring practice and the spring game.
Yeah, but the first time we catch up with Will since spring practice has started, so we'll get into some of the storylines. Of course, Lagway in the shoulder, kind of being the headliner right there. Last time we had Will on, that was the week spring practice started, so spring practice has, we've had a few spring practices so far, so we'll go through that storyline, some players who are maybe a little more available than what we thought in Trey Wilson and Jamari Lyons. We'll get into that conversation. The youth and the defensive backfield, I think, is another topic I hit on last episode of Gators Breakdown with Jordan Castell talking about it, Billy Napier talking about it. We'll get Will's thoughts on it right here. Look, you guys have gotten my thoughts the last few episodes, so it was time to bring Will on. I'm tired. I'm sure y'all are tired of my voice, so we'll bring Will on and get his thoughts there. But of course, hey, our spring football coverage right here on Gators Breakdown all spring long is brought to you by Florida Victorious, and it is a great time to join. You can be the difference by joining Florida Victorious. Your support can directly impact the outcome on the field. If you want to help the Gators win, well, just like when you pack the swamp, your unwavering support through Florida Victorious empowers the Gators to be their best. If you enjoy player access, you'll find it at Florida Victorious. Members receive invitations to exclusive events like the meet and greet after the orange and blue game, access to exclusive merchandise and memorabilia, great sports coverage from Nick De La Torre, and more. There's never been a better time to join. So join today, make a difference in bringing victory to the orange and blue. Visit floridavictorious.com to join now. All right, so let's get to it. DJ Lagway, of course, and we've talked about the quarterback depth chart a bit, and I know you've kind of went into it on one of the previous episodes of Gators Breakdown. But just to update, well, there's not really much of an update since the first spring practice and Billy Napier having that press conference and kind of setting it off that hey, Lagway's going to be limited, and even when Billy Napier was saying how they were going to limit him, we still weren't really sure until we saw it with our eyes. Florida's had, 4 or 5 spring practices so far, and Lagway has not been seen in any of the open portions throwing yet. Of course, the shoulder that dates back to, of course, we chronicled it, dating back to the Miami game early in the season, the second game of the season with Stanford too, when the talk started coming out that Lagway was having somewhat shoulder issues, but went through the season anyway with that shoulder. So will the open portions of practice have happened? We still have not seen DJ Lagway throw a ball yet, going through a lot of the reps and taking the snaps and doing dropbacks, but you just don't see him launching the ball down the field just yet, doing some handoffs. Of course, that's during the open portions of practice. But if you ask around, he's not throwing in spring right now. I know Andy Staples of On 3 had a report out there last week as well, saying DJ Lagway may not throw at all in spring practice. And to me, that's when I would start to really worry. That would be the beginning of the worry. Really worry probably is the best way to put that. That would be when the worry could start, is if we don't see Lagway throw at all in the spring. Behind the scenes, that could be the word, or that is the word that could be the case here. So at least in the open portions of practice, we haven't seen it yet. What's your thoughts on it? Well, certainly a little concerning when the word second opinion comes in from Billy Napier and you don't see him throw just yet. So a little bit, I think timeline plays into it a little bit before it gets too crazy there, but certainly raises the ping a little bit.
Yeah, look, I think everything has to be done to make sure that DJ Lagway is healthy when Florida travels to Baton Rouge on September 13th, right? If you got to hold him out against the Sharks of LIU on August 30th, if you got to hold him out even against South Florida in the second game, you need him ready for that stretch where you're at LSU, at Miami, versus Texas and at Texas A&M. Like, those games are the ones where he has to be ready. And so, look, if he's ready because you've prevented him from throwing during the spring, and that makes sure there's no setbacks and he's ready to go when fall camp hits, okay, great. Like, I don't know that you're going to teach him touch on a pass that he isn't going to be able to figure out. Obviously, if he had shoulder issues last year, didn't really show it when he was out there chucking the deep ball. The places where it maybe impacted him were on the short throws, and then you wouldn't necessarily think the shoulder injury would be this thing that would hold him back if it's not holding him back on the deep throws. So, I think I'm going to look at it and say it's an abundance of caution by Florida. They recognize that you can make a legitimate case that DJ Lagway's already the best quarterback in the SEC coming into 2025. And if you're going to make that case, you got to protect that guy with kid gloves, right? We saw what happened when he went out against Georgia, when he went out against Texas. Those were massacres against Florida. Once he went down, the Georgia game, a little bit less of a massacre, but if you look at the overall statistics, it's pretty clear Georgia was a superior team, and I think Florida thought they had a legit shot to win after Lagway hit Mizell on the opening touchdown there. So the long and short of it is Billy Napier and Florida and everybody knows this team's going nowhere without Lagway at quarterback. And so, am I concerned? Only if you're getting to that LIU game and the South Florida game and there's no projection for him to be playing against LSU, because that's what you need. You need him healthy there. And a lot of the stuff that he's going to be doing is figuring out the adjustments he's going to make at the line of scrimmage, figuring out how is he going to manipulate the protections, how is he going to check down when something's open, or when the defense decides to drop a bunch of defenders into space. How is he going to figure out who's going to be open in situations where the defense throws something at him he hasn't seen before? Those are things that, yes, you'd love to rep, but I think you can rep without letting the ball rip. And so that's what he's going to do right now. And, look, I would love it if he was out there throwing. There's no doubt that I would feel much more sanguine about things if we weren't talking about the best hope for Florida to be good having an injury and having an injury to his throwing shoulder. But given what we saw last year, It looks, and given what he did with his hamstring as well, I don't think there's any doubt that DJ Lagway can play through pain. And so then it's just going to be a question of what's his pain tolerance and making sure that he's able to make it to those first few important games of the season healthy. So, we're not going to see him during the spring game, but he wasn't going to teach us anything during the spring game anyway.
Yeah.
And I even said this a couple of weeks ago that Harrison Bailey is the guy I was looking at in the spring game.
Right.
His backup quarterback. Like, Florida has to figure out who the backup quarterback is. I mean, Aiden Warner's still on the roster. Obviously last year they brought in Clay Millen through the transfer portal, thought he was going to be somebody who could be the third string quarterback. Mertz goes down, Lagway goes down, and you've got Warner in there in the Georgia games and the Texas games, averaging like 3.5 yards a throw or something. That ain't going to get it done. If they have to go for any stretch without Lagway, they need those guys to have gotten enough reps to where they're prepared. So if I'm to look at it, I'd say the silver lining to all of this is that those guys are going to get plenty of reps. They're going to understand Napier's offense. There's no excuse for Florida's backup quarterback and even third string quarterback to not be prepared when the fall comes around, because they've gotten all the spring reps. And so, again, silver lining, I'd love for Lagway to be out there getting those reps, but if he's not going to get them, you've removed any excuse, right? I mean, I remember 2013 with Will Muschamp, where every quarterback went down, and all of a sudden you got a guy out there who, we're losing games, but can you really blame that on Muschamp? And you start asking those questions. If the season falls apart for Florida and because Lagway goes down, that's still on Billy Napier, because they've brought in guys who they've targeted through the transfer portal, brought them in, and they've gotten plenty of reps in the spring. And so the team needs to be able to at least stay afloat while they're waiting for their star to come back.
Yeah, I think you start looking for reasons why you'd want him out there. Of course, just in general, we'd love to have him out there. But, a rapport with some of the new receivers. You got the freshman receivers, Ronell Brown, Dallas Wilson getting reps. You'd love to have a rapport with them. Jay Michael started it from the transfer portal, coming in, a rapport with them. I mean, much has been made about 4 or 5 offensive linemen coming in, and the continuity you have there, well, you don't have the quarterback behind them to go along with that continuity. So those are the reasons you'd love to have him out there. How much does that matter in the grand scheme of things? Probably not a whole lot. I mean, that would be the bonus of having him out there. That's not going to keep Florida. If Florida goes out there and loses to LSU and loses to Miami, I'm not going to sit here and go back and say, well, if DJ Lagway had been going through the spring, I think Florida wins those games. No, I'm not going to go that far with it. Yeah, I think there is things that they would be bonuses, but I don't think that would end up costing Florida. As long as he's healthy and he's ready to, as long as he's 100% healthy, ready to go in the fall, I'm not going to look back at spring and say, well, if he had just had those reps in the spring, that would have made a whole difference for Florida. We know what DJ Lagway can do. Like you said, Will, there's a lot he can do, the mental reps, and when teams want to drop in the coverage against him, that he can learn without letting the ball go, without throwing the ball 50 yards down the field. There are certainly those things, but grand scheme of things, like you said, we had to be way down the road before I'm going to be concerned. It certainly raises the alarm bell because you rather have your starting quarterback out there, and maybe if it's a nagging injury that dated back to the beginning of the season, that comes into play. Certainly, is it going to continue being an issue for DJ Lagway? Certainly, I think that's an angle we have to keep looking at since this is kind of the second time we've been hearing about it, as we heard about it earlier in the season and now again in spring practice. But I agree with you, Will. It's more of a good abundance of caution.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. One is, how many reps did he get with DK, Badger, and Wilson last year in comparison to Mertz, right? He was obviously sharing. Now, I do think he got some first-team reps with those guys, but it was, the fact that they were doing like 3 drives for Mertz and then a drive for Lagway indicates that he wasn't necessarily I don't imagine that he had this giant rapport with those guys when he came in there. It just turns out he's really good and was able to take advantage of it. Now, the one thing I will say is that this does reveal the fragility of the Napier era, right? So Carson Beck played like crap last year. Quinn Ewers didn't play well last year. Both Georgia and Texas make the playoff. And the surrounding roster that those guys had, or that those programs had, enabled those teams to make the playoffs, even with quarterbacks who were average or even slightly below average. Florida does not have that kind of roster. And so, having a guy like Graham Mertz, who actually played really, really well last year, other than the Miami game, in the time that he was in there, isn't enough to get Florida to where they want to be. What they need is a souped-up version of the Lagway that they got last year in order to be there. And I think, look, I'm going to break down Bailey, and I'm going to break down Warner and what we see in the spring game and all that sort of stuff. But I think we all recognize that the fragility of the program rides on DJ Lagway's right shoulder. Yeah. And so I don't know that the concern is necessarily that he wouldn't be ready for fall practice or something like that. The concern is when he takes a hit in the game against LSU or the game against A&M, like, is the shoulder going to get worse? Is the shoulder going to be re-aggravated? Like, those are the things that I'm sort of thinking about. When you hear the word second opinion and stuff like that, that's what I'm thinking about is, like, we knew we were like one time where he took off and ran in that LSU game or the Ole Miss game from not seeing him again for the rest of the year. And I think we all thought that after the Georgia game that we weren't going to see him for the rest of the year. Yeah. And so, that's how fragile the program is. And that's what's been built, right? I mean, what's been built is a team that can compete with sort of the mid-level teams in the SEC on a regular basis, but is going to need elite quarterback play to get to where they want to go. I think we all know Lagway can provide that. I think we're all skeptical there's anybody else on the roster who can provide that. And so it just indicates the razor's edge of where the program is, and that 2025 is going to hinge on Lagway's right shoulder. And we always knew that, but now it's going to hinge on the health of Lagway's shoulder, not just his right shoulder. And so it's one more concern amongst some of the other concerns that you would have about the roster heading into the year. Again, I think Florida is set up to have, I think 2025 is a better opportunity for them to make a run than 2026, given some of the guys who are coming back both on offense and defense. And so this is the year that you want to see them take that step. And that is one of the things, right? I mean, he's not getting those reps, and I know we're not going to come back and use the spring as an excuse, but we are talking about a guy who, if he plays exactly like he did last year, I don't think Florida makes the playoffs. I think he has to play better than he did last year. I think he's got to be as good as Jackson Dart was last year in order for Florida to get to where they want to be. Now, that's not a huge jump because Lagway QB rating was 155, but Dart was 181. And so, it's a significant jump. Dart averaged 10.8 yards per throw, but had 29 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. Lagway was at 10 yards per throw, had 12 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. So there's room for improvement. I think we all know that, and that is the concern. But you got to do what you got to do to make sure he's on the field once you're done with the Sharks and the Bulls, and the bullets really start flying against LSU. And so anything that it takes to get him on the field. Whatever kind of masseuses you need, if you need to go in there and clean something up, if you got to have, I mean, honestly, like, let's get a team trainer to feed him so he doesn't have to use his right arm. Like, I don't care what it takes. Make sure he's ready to go against LSU.
And look, and going back to, I think it was last week, Florida put out a highlight video of one of the practices, and DJ Lagway's right there doing a push-up. I mean, so if it's that bad and all that stuff, I don't know if he'd be. First of all, we'd even be taking a chance of him going through the drills and all that besides throwing the ball. But also, sit there doing push-ups. And look, I know it's not the same. It's not the same motion. There's a lot that goes into it. But if it's really bad, you're not going to have DJ Lagway on video sitting there doing a push-up and putting it in a video. So that's where, the concern, I don't think, really
can't
all
control it. Can't control it, right? I mean,
yeah.
All you can do is hope, because, boy, will it be a miserable season if we're watching Harrison Bailey start all year long. So,
hey, well, some good news on DJ Lagway. I want to make sure I put it out there. His foundation. And last week, I put an article out on gatorsbreakdown.com. But he hosted the DJ Lagway Foundation kickoff dinner last week and will donate $50,000 in support to UF Health community programs. So certainly not enough good news in this world, and certainly when we can share it, we need to be sharing it. But from generous donors and all the monies raised, it will assist UF Health in providing essential resources for local youth. So he doesn't have to do this. He absolutely doesn't have to do this. But a young kid who's got his head on right, and he goes on to say, growing up, my family has always prioritized giving back to the community, and we've seen the impact it can make through NIL. I had the chance to be part of that change, to use the opportunity for good. And I'm so thankful for everyone who joined us at the Foundation kickoff dinner. Seeing this event come to life and knowing how the funds we raise will benefit the local community is just the start of what we can accomplish together. Will, that is NIL at its finest right there in college football.
Yeah, I would say for all the old men yelling at the clouds, and I include myself in that sometimes. Obviously college football is changing, and those of us who grew up with, Ohio State not playing USC or something when, for split national titles and those sorts of things. It's a very different era than those of us who were alive and kicking back then. But I think one of the things that you realize is, and you realize this as you get older, is money reveals who you are. It doesn't change who you are. And so, you win the lottery, and a lot of those people who win the lottery are broke 5 years later, right? And a lot of them end up in jail because they've gotten, had some sort of drunk driving charge and those sorts of things too. But then you've got the people who win the lottery and it doesn't change their life at all. And, honestly, I bought a couple lottery tickets just so I could have the conversation with my kids on the way home and go, okay, what would you change if we had $200 million? Knowing full well that we're more likely to get hit by a bolt of lightning on the way home than we are to actually win. But it's a fascinating thought exercise because it reveals the character or the things that they really care about. And so I think that's the thing that I would say about Lagway in this particular circumstance is that money is revealing his character, and his character is something that Florida fans should be proud of and should point to and should support the program such that more folks like DJ Lagway can have those opportunities through the NIL. So that's about as close as I'll ever get to advocating giving something to Florida Victorious. But look, I think it's awesome that he's doing it. I think we've all known that Lagway was a special kid throughout this entire process. I mean, look, he probably could have gotten more money going someplace else when it came to his commitment to Florida, and certainly with yokels like me making all the noise we were about Napier and where he was at, you wouldn't necessarily look at him and say, oh, how dare he leave when that coach is under fire. Folks would have understood it if he'd decided to go someplace else for more money or someplace else to a program that maybe was already showing progress. But instead he came here because he has ultimate confidence in himself and comes here, wears number 2, so sort of gets to forge his own identity with that. And then obviously this is just sort of I think a reflection of who he is, who his family is, to raise him and have the kind of character that when he's getting this kind of money, that giving and try to teach my kids, give, save, and spend some of everything you get, right? And if it's all for you, then it's probably not healthy. And so Lagway has learned that lesson, learned it early.
Yeah, speaking at a recent press conference as well, Florida Gators head coach Billy Napier highlighted Lagway's character and maturity, saying, based off of this foundation, quote, I think he's got a sincere care for people, and I think that he's mature enough to know that's what life's about. I think he's using his platform in the way it was intended. I think this guy will continue to be that type of leader, that type of example. So we're extremely proud of him and the approach that he's taken. So certainly.
I will say from a PR perspective, based on Napier and all we know about him, and I think what we heard about him coming in, this is something they should really lean into, right? From not just from the standpoint of your star quarterback, DJ Lagway, that sort of stuff, but from the standpoint of if you're a parent, do you want your kid going to Florida? Those sorts of things, and what I've been looking for all along is what's a differentiator? Right? How does Florida differentiate themselves? And obviously a lot of programs differentiate themselves just with funds, right? They have so much money that they are able to bring in every single elite high school, college player that they want, or every person in the transfer portal that they want. But to me, this is a differentiator that that your son is going to be surrounded by people with this kind of character. And I think it's worthwhile for Florida to sort of toot their own horns and toot Lagway's horn and say, not only are you coming here to become a better football player, but you're coming here to sort of live out the kind of man you want to be. Now, that sounds all well and good, but obviously there's always the joke that when people get arrested, we're like, we're back,
Yeah.
So there is a balance, right, in terms of those sorts of things. But
Will, to your point, I can't tell you how many times behind the scenes I hear when I have players on through Florida Victorious and they talk about the work in the community, and they really enjoy going to those schools and interacting with those kids, and to also build those homes with Habitat for Humanity, because it brings a level of a person to what we see. It's not just a football helmet and shoulder pads. And don't get me wrong, we all know that comes first, and that's what we cheer for. But if we can cheer for the things off the field at the same time, I think that makes for a better product and what we get to enjoy. So I think that's probably been one of my favorite parts of bringing the players on and the access we get to them, because we get to see the other things they get to do. And as you said, I think it's really led by Billy Napier and what he wants these guys to do and be parts of the community and be part of Gainesville and be part of the state of Florida. And I think we hear that every time we have players on.
Yeah, look, man, I mean, I go to work because it feeds my family and it helps put a roof over our heads, and it's necessary in order to support my family. But some of the best days of my life are ones, there's something up here in Philly called Broad Street Missions, where you go down and you serve folks who are indigent, but you serve, like, you put on a uniform and you serve them as a waiter, and then you're expected after you serve them to sit down and talk to them about their life and that sort of stuff. Some of the most rewarding stuff I've ever done. Now, I don't get to do it that often, but I'm given that opportunity. When I have the opportunity, I come back and go, why don't I do that more often?
Yeah.
So, the fact that Florida's got that stuff set up for those players gives them an opportunity to really start to maybe lean into that a little bit. And look, I'm not expecting the 5-star corner from Los Angeles to decide to come to Florida because he's going to feel good doing volunteer work for the community. At the same time, I think there's an opportunity to lean into that the thing that everybody intuitively knows the minute they get a lot of money. Like there's a certain amount of money you need to live, and you go, okay, without that amount of money, I'm really uncomfortable. Then most of us, I'll say men in this category, but most people build their career to a certain point and then look around and realize there must be something more than this, right? And so these kids are getting to that early because, I mean, look, if you got paid $1 million to come somewhere, like, you've accomplished financially just about everything that most people aim to accomplish in a lifetime, right? I mean, most of us are sort of aiming for those $1 million, $2 million, $3 million markers, and over time, and if you hit that marker, you look around and go, is this it? So the idea that Florida has the ability to pour into that and do that with a leader like Lagway, I think, is a way to differentiate and, honestly, a way to produce what colleges are supposed to produce, which is a learning experience for student athletes, quote unquote, as opposed to just being a feeder school for the NFL. And look, I think you could do both. Like I said, I still go to work. Like, I don't sit there. I'm not Mother Teresa. I do not just forego all secular things to go down and volunteer. But I'll say the volunteer work is awesome. And one of the highlights of a new job I took recently is they gave us a couple of days to go do volunteer work that's not vacation. And that is a major selling point for one of the work-life balance type initiatives that they have, is that, I can go do that sort of thing in the middle of the day, and I don't have to take a vacation day, and, I don't have to worry about where my kids are on a weekend and that sort of stuff. So, look, kudos to Florida, kudos to Lagway, and, use it to recruit.
There we go. Let's continue some spring practice storylines here, Will. And two players coming into spring. We weren't really sure how available they would be after injuries last season, and they've been taking part in spring and taking pretty active, and they're on each side of the ball. So let's go wide receiver Trey Wilson and defensive lineman Jamari Lyons. So I think great to see both those guys out there. Weren't sure how available they'll be. They're in the black jerseys, but they're out there running, and Billy Napier out there saying, it's really great to see number 3 in that black jersey out there, zooming and putting together highlight reel plays out there in spring practice right now. So we'll start with him there, Will. I really dove into Trey Wilson on the last episode of Gators Breakdown. He was speaking to the media as well. He looks bigger. He looks thicker. Going to be a versatile piece. Play inside, play outside, play special teams. We're looking for that second-year jump last year. Injuries, certainly go a long way in hampering him. We saw his explosive ability with DJ Lagway at quarterback a couple times. So, certainly good to see him out there, probably a little more active than we thought he would be. Yeah,
I mean, look, I think he was injured relatively early in the season last year. Now, you figured they would take it easy with him, but I'm not sure this is an off season for Florida to take it easy. I think this is, like I said, I think 2025 is the place where you're pointing towards. And the other part of it is that Trey Wilson, if he'd have gone to the NFL draft, I still think even if he'd run like a 4.4 40, you're not talking about a guy who's going early in the draft because of injury concerns, because of size, those sorts of things. And so, I still think that's going to be an issue. right? I mean, one of the things that people are going to talk about and ask about him and the measurables and all that sort of stuff is going to be his size. So he's added some weight, but he's not going to get a whole lot taller. He's always going to be sort of, you use the word scoot, scoot, scoot. He's always going to be that sort of player. He does take an awful lot of hits, like on those end arounds when he's coming around. Like, I don't recall a ton of times where he's not getting, like where he's made guys miss and made them look foolish, and then has avoided getting a hit. And, you think about like Emmitt Smith in the NFL, and certainly at Florida as well, but in the NFL, like one of his big skills was he'd get a 6-yard run and he'd be on the ground and nobody really hit him directly. Like, he wasn't Barry Sanders. He wasn't the guy out there who was turning a negative 5-yard run into a 50-yard touchdown. But Smith was able to sort of avoid contact all the way through. Wilson hasn't necessarily shown that yet. And so I think there's some opportunities to sort of, one, expand his role to where he's not just the guy getting the little pitch behind the line of scrimmage. But the other thing is, I had a long piece in the preseason magazine last year detailing the different ways that Florida used Trey Wilson. They had him as running back for a little while, where they had Montrell Johnson as a lead blocker. They had him on like screen passes. They had him obviously sort of faking screen passes and then going out on sort of hitches and slants and those sorts of things. And then obviously there's some opportunities maybe if you've isolated him as a running back on a linebacker to send him downfield deep. There haven't been a lot of shots deep to him. And part of that, I think, is, look, he came in as a true freshman. He played right away, had last offseason to sort of learn some of the offense, but really didn't have much time to apply it because of the injury. And so what do you build on that? How do you build extra wrinkles? How do you make sure that you're putting him in positions where maybe he avoids some of that contact that he's gotten because you've given the ball behind the line of scrimmage so often that he's got to make people miss. How can they give him the ball behind the line, behind the cornerbacks, behind the safeties, and really utilize his speed and his ability to separate in a way that we haven't seen so far? So it's great to see him out there, obviously. And whenever you've got a wide receiver with a lower body injury, you get concerned that there might be re-injury or something like that. So the fact that he's out there quite a bit, means they're not really concerned about that, and so that's great. But again, I mean, you talk about like, I think it's probably more important that Wilson and Sturdivant and Mizell and those guys build chemistry with Bailey and Warner and those guys than it is that they build it with Lagway. I think the chemistry angle means a lot more when you have a quarterback who's a little bit less gifted. And so the good news is because Wilson's out there, they're going to have their starting wide receivers working with those backup quarterbacks. So again, I go to no excuses for the backup quarterback. He's had all the prep, all the reps that he needs in order to be successful. And so, hopefully we don't have to see it, but if we do, we should see the backup quarterback able to step in and be successful.
Now, let's go to the other side. And we know Florida was interested in getting a defensive tackle, nose tackle in the winter transfer portal. With getting pretty far with Keyshawn Silver from Kentucky before he committed to USC, and then Hero Kanu from Ohio State before he committed to Texas. And it's welcome news that Jamari Lyons is doing as much as he is out there after pretty bad leg injury last fall camp. It ruins his season, ends his season before it even gets started. So if he can come along and be what we thought he could be, then I think Florida is okay without having to get someone in the portal at those positions at the spot. Especially Mekhi Burrow, DeAndre Robinson are there as well. Can never have too many of those guys, of course, in the middle of a defensive line. So if the move is to still go out, try and find one, then great. But as long as Lyons is ready to go, not as dire as it maybe looked a couple months ago.
Yeah, this is one where I think I'll push back a little bit, just in that ACL injuries are usually, like big-time knee injuries are usually, especially for guys who rely on explosion, are usually more than a year to recover, right? They're back on the field in a year, but you don't necessarily see the type of explosion. You see this with running backs all the time, where the running back comes back from a knee injury and, he's okay when he comes back, but he's not necessarily a difference maker. So that would be the only thing that I would say as a caveat. Obviously, Lyons was injured pretty early in camp last year, and so has had a little, it's not like he got injured in the fifth game and is coming back. So he's not
like Aaron Gates gets injured in Ole Miss game and really late in the season.
Yeah. Now, the one thing I will say is that, and this is where sort of the cascade effect comes into play, is that Cam James did play on the inside quite a bit last year. But with a guy like Pyburn leaving, you kind of expect him to have to move to the outside and be the guy who's going to spell a Tyreek Sapp or something like that at the defensive end position. You'll have Gums on the other side and McCray probably at the other sort of jack position. but that leaves, Banks coming back. So that's why that was a huge deal. You already mentioned Robinson and Boyru. Lyons is going to have to take some snaps if they're not bringing a bunch of guys in through the transfer portal. So, the question will be, are they, and this is honestly, this is the question in the transfer portal. I've got a big article in the preseason magazine coming out in a couple of months where we're going to be looking at the transfer portal and what you get out of those guys. But, I don't know that they need fantastic play out of Lyons. They just need steady play so that it's not a giant hole when Banks is out. And I would say the same thing about, it's what we saw last year with Pyburn, right? Is that you don't necessarily need outstanding play. You just need steady play when Sapp isn't on the field. So that's sort of the thing I think that we need to understand. So Lyons a couple years ago had 198 snaps, a 65 PFF rating. 65, 66 is usually average. So if he can replicate that, then I think Florida will be successful, or at least.
And word was before he got injured. He was looking to be. We know how you talked about spring camp lies earlier. Fall camp lies. that happens too. But word was he was really coming along to be that 1B to Cam Jackson and basically be a starter in his own right.
Well, and look, it's not like he doesn't have a profile that suggests that he would be a good SEC player, right? But this is where the knee becomes the caveat, right? Is the knee fully healthy? And look, I tore a patella 10 years ago, and there are still times where I don't necessarily trust it when I'm out there, going to play basketball like I did when I injured it to start with. You go up for a rebound, there's always that fear in the back of your mind that when you come back down again, you're going to have to deal with it. I think in some cases, the reason it takes more than a year to recover is because in that first off season, you're rehabbing, you're not necessarily as strong as you'd like to be, and you've got a little bit of self-doubt when it comes to, can I really push the pedal down, or do you put sort of a mental governor on there? And I think some guys are able to separate that and say, you know what, if I have to go through the rehab again, I'll go through the rehab again, but I have to push it in order to be who I need to be. And I think other guys are like, I'm going to go a little bit slower. So that'll be the question with Lyons. I don't think we'll have that answer in spring camp, but certainly, like you said, good to have him out there because Florida's been looking in that portal, hasn't necessarily brought a bunch of dudes in. And so the competition there requires Lyons to be at least serviceable. And again, I don't know that he needs to be a transformative player up front.
Can he be Cam Jackson? Cam Jackson wasn't transformative, but a steady piece that you knew what you were getting.
Yep. Well, and someone who can take advantage when the defense double teams Banks or something.
Yeah.
Right? You don't necessarily need to win the double teams. You don't need to command a double team. The question is, when you get a one-on-one against the center or a one-on-one against a guard, are you able to make the quarterback uncomfortable? Or are you able to push the offensive lineman back into that quarterback? Are you able to blow up some runs in the backfield? Those sorts of things. And, we'll see. I think I am, for positions that require strength and explosion, I'm much more hesitant to look at a knee injury and just dismiss it versus, if it was like a right guard, it's like, okay, that's not necessarily a guy that you're looking for explosion. That's a guy where technique becomes critical. And look, I'm not saying those guys aren't strong, but I'm saying in terms of first step, right? First step, that's what you always talk about when you're talking about a defensive lineman. For a linebacker, not necessarily, and for a cornerback, a lot of that is technique based as well. So anyway, we shall see. I think, like you said, it's good to have him out there. Good to have him on the roster as a number, if nothing else. But that'll be the question to me coming into the spring portal season is. So maybe that's the real thing here, right? Is that Florida has an opportunity to assess what do they have in Lyons.
Yeah.
And then they can determine, do we need to spend significant NIL capital in order to bring in major competition? Do we need to bring in a guy who's injury insurance? Or do we not need to bring in anybody at all? And they can sort of make that determination.
Because as I said, we know the interest was there. We know the interest was there. The two guys I mentioned where Florida was heavily, heavily involved. And would have loved to have either one of those guys.
Well, look, I think I've said this a couple times tonight. Florida recognizes the coaches recognize that 2025 is an opportunity to flip the narrative. It's an opportunity to win some games, and it's an opportunity to turn those wins into recruiting success because of the promises that they're making those recruits right now, I'm sure, about how the program is about to turn a corner. And if you're not able to turn the corner because you can't stop the run because your defensive tackles can't hold up, well, obviously it's going to be rough sailing, and Lyons is a part of that. The development of Boyru and Robinson is a part of that. Banks coming back and playing as well or better than he did last year is a part of that, and then being able to maybe slide Cam James inside, and that sort of relies on a guy like LJ McCray stepping up and them saying we can't keep him off the field. And so we're going to slide somebody inside instead of saying, oh, crap, we need a backup on the outside. We're going to slide him outside, and that opens up a hole inside. So those are the things I'm sure that they're assessing this spring. And you miss on the guys who are your main targets in the fall. That doesn't mean there won't be guys who come available in the spring. But how aggressive they are in the spring probably tied very heavily to what they see with all the guys on the defensive line. But Lyons is a big part of that.
Absolutely. So a couple more position groups we'll go through before, with these spring storylines before we sign off here. Well, offensive line, and pretty interesting storylines there with, we know the 4 or 5 are coming back, but is it going to be 4 starters coming back? Because Roderick Kearney might maybe pushing Damian George there at right guard. And then, for that open spot there, of course, getting the word, Bryce Lovett there at right tackle, and kind of I think we discussed that, and we thought that would be the way Florida would go. He started in the bowl game for Florida against Tulane, but maybe more of I would say probably Damian George ends up being the starter there at right guard, but a true competition there between him and Roger Kearney, and at least Roger Kearney going to be garnering some snaps. One of the higher offensive line recruits Florida has brought in under Billy Napier, so certainly in year 3 of a Roger Kearney, you hope the development would pay off enough where he is contributing in some form or fashion, being a highly rated recruit like he was. Of course, he's from the 904, so I'm hoping he's out there even more so I can brag on Jacksonville guys. But as we look at offensive line, 4 or 5 returning, but competition's a good thing there. Development, hey, it's about time for it to pay off.
Yeah, I think Florida has brought in better offensive line prospects under Billy Napier than they had certainly under Dan Mullen and Jim McElwain.
And a good number of them.
Yeah, and they a pretty good number. There have been a couple of times where you would have hoped they would have gotten 4, where they've only gotten 3. But I think the bigger thing is with the 4 guys returning that you're talking about, with Cam Waits coming back, and again, that's a guy who had an Achilles injury, and this is 2 years off of that, right? And then you've got Kearney, who had 74 snaps last year, but a PFF rating of 80. You got Lovett, 362 snaps, with a PFF rating of 73.3. You got Fletcher Westphal, who is probably the highest rated guy they've got in terms of a recruit. You got Jason Zandamela, who is a transfer,
highly rated
guy coming in. So, and then you got Devon Manuel, right? 417 snaps last year, 69.4 PFF rating. So, this is one of those spots where I'm hoping that Florida gets more than average. Like there are places where you look at the Gators and say, and I think one of the things I said coming right into the offseason was, this is one of the few years where we don't have to project what Florida could be in order to feel good about what Florida has bringing back. The offensive line is one of those places. However, if we do project that some of these guys take a step forward because of competition, because, maybe just overall, say the right guard spot is better because if Florida suffers an injury, they have the ability to slide somebody else in there, those sorts of things. I think, overall, you could project the offensive line play is going to be better than it has been the last couple of years based on these guys coming back and the depth that's there. And so there are some places where you can look at Florida's team and go, if a guy goes down, we're going to struggle. We spent the first 20 minutes talking about quarterback, and that's obviously the main one. But even like wide receiver, like if Sturdivant goes down early in the year, what does that do? They don't have another guy with his size, certainly with his experience. If you got a guy like Bryce Thornton go down, or Jordan Castell go down, or Devin Moore at cornerback go down, and obviously that's been a struggle for his first 3 years here in Gainesville. Those are things where you go, okay, that opens up a major hole. I think the thing that, whether Kearney is able to win the job or not, the fact that he is pushing to win the job means not only does George get better in that process if he wins the job, But also, if anything happens to George, you're not panicking. You know you've got somebody who's solid, can back them up, and can make sure that DJ Lagway, if he's back there, stays healthy. Because, again, out of everything, making sure that guy stays off the ground is the most important thing Florida can do.
Absolutely, absolutely. So last little group right here, we'll go to and secondary injuries opening up chances. Kind of you just alluded to it right there. But Will, maybe the main storyline maybe throughout a whole spring practice so far, Cormani McClain bulking up, getting starting reps with D.D. Johnson being sidelined with injury right now. So lining up across from Devin Moore at the other corner spot. And then you get the injuries to, of course, Sharif Denson and Aaron Gates and Bryce Thornton. And now you have Josiah Davis and Greg Smith, the second-year players, getting reps, getting their chances. And then true freshmen Drake Stubbs, Lagonza Hayward, Ben Hanks getting reps as well. With all of the injuries, and this is an angle, though, for me, Will, to kind of look at it. There's a lot of new here. You got all the injuries and staff changes. Safety, cornerback coach, both those guys. So there's a lot of new in the secondary for spring football. So thankfully they get to work these kinks out with new coaches and with all the injuries, some new faces.
Yeah, I mean, so I will believe the Cormani McClain hype when I see him on the field. But I would say, I mean, it's not specifically to McClain. It's the reality from the – now, look, does he have the talent profile to be that kind of guy? Absolutely, right? I mean, this is one of the things why when he didn't commit to Florida originally that we were upset about it, because he has a profile to be an NFL caliber cornerback, and maybe even like an all-pro NFL caliber cornerback, depending upon if things fall right. And so if he can turn into that guy, if Florida has a lockdown corner on one side and then has a guy like Devin Moore on the other side, well, all of a sudden we're talking about the defensive backs being a strength rather than a weakness. Because Johnson played pretty well last year. I think Sharif Denson at the Star played pretty well last year. You brought in Caraway, the transfer, who at least was above average last year. And so, the depth starts to look any defense looks much different when you bring in a guy and go, all right, defense can't throw at that wide receiver, or the offense can't throw at that wide receiver, right? Like the quarterback is just going to take him off of the list. And look, I mean, if you look at what Ron Roberts had to do last year, it was a lot of too high safeties. It was a lot of help for the corners. It was a lot of bend but don't break, and a lot of times, especially if you look back at the Ole Miss game, some stuff where Florida probably got away with some things in the red zone, was able to make some stops, certainly, but those aren't things you can rely on all year long and expect to hold teams down to 17, 20 points, those sorts of things. And so a step up for McClain is a huge deal for that overall unit. Now, what I would say is one of the interesting things from last year, if you look at it, is Bryce Thornton really stepped up big time from LSU on. Yeah. And so if you'd have looked at him, if you looked at his PFF rating, his stats, anything like that, prior to the LSU game, it was like, sort of middling play. He ends up the year at 70.3 overall for his PFF rating, way above average, but it's incredibly backloaded. I don't know that it's necessarily a coincidence that against LSU and Ole Miss and then obviously Florida State and Tulane, not quite as good, but against those teams that Thornton was sort of a driving force. Jordan Castell took a step back last year, but that doesn't mean that he didn't show that he has the capability of being a significantly above average safety as well. And so, there's a world where Devin Moore stays healthy, Cormani McClain turns into a 5-star performer on the field, Castell jumps back to his performance from 2 years ago, or maybe even improves, and Thornton builds on what happened in the last 4 games last year, and we're looking at a secondary that's just completely different. Now, this is one where I have to project, right?
Yeah, right. You're right. You're right.
We have to project a lot to get there. But I mean, when Gates went down last year, we went, who's going to be there? And but you bring in Caraway, you mentioned Smith, Johnson, and Denson, and those guys. They're starting to build something back there. But the reality is the ability of the defense to take a step forward, a significant step forward, is going to be tied to them being less predictable. And the way to be less predictable is to have a corner who you can lock down the outside wide receiver, but you also have the ability to drop into off coverage if you want to, and then let him be a ball hawk, right? So essentially what defenses did to Lagway sometime last year, where they would drop 8, and now you've got these small holes. Well, if you've got a guy like Lagway, or if you've got a guy like McClain who's really, really fast, well, now he's able to close those gaps much faster than some other guys who might be out there. And now you got a guy whose eyes are on the quarterback the entire time, and you can go get a game-changing type of interception. So, look, I love that we're hearing that he's having a great time out, or that he's having a great camp out there. But we'll see what we see in the spring game from him, and then obviously when the lights come on in the fall is when the rubber really meets the road. And if Florida can find a way to cut down half the field to where the opposing offenses just don't go in that direction, oh man! I mean, think about like when they had Tabor and Wilson, right out there corner, and you're just like, go ahead, throw that direction, right? Good, right? And I mean, obviously you got like Marcus May out there and Keanu Neal at safety. So I mean, but those are the types of it's not a coincidence that when those 4 guys were roaming the field, that Florida's defense was just completely locked down, right? Like, you can only do so much with your defensive line. At some point, the defensive backs have to be good, if not great, for you to have a truly locked down defense. And if McClain can take a step up, Florida takes a major step in that direction.
Yeah, and this spring really throwing this freshman in by fire, which we knew. I mean, we knew Florida had these injuries coming into spring practice. We talked about it all winter long. And then Hilton Drake Stubbs, Gonza Hayward, Ben Hanks getting a lot of these reps. So kind of going back to one of your points earlier, Will, maybe the silver lining of some of these injuries or these guys getting the reps that they wouldn't otherwise get. Now, Florida has the practice format where they try and rotate as many guys as they possibly can, but now with this, they're getting second team reps because Billy Napier even said it in his last press conference. I'm sitting there looking at the second team, and they're all true freshmen out there. So Florida's recruited well on defense this last class, up front, at linebacker, in the secondary as well. Those guys getting those reps in spring practice.
Now, again, I think this points to the fragility of the roster, right? Is that every roster these days has, like, if you look at any team.
Yeah, there you go. Hey, you read my mind. That's where I was going to go. It's not unique to Florida.
Well, but again, I think Texas can afford a few losses through injury that Florida can't.
Right, yeah. There's levels to it.
Yeah. I think Georgia and Alabama, though we'll see with Bama given the start to the DeBoer era. But, those are teams, Ohio State, right, can lose some players and still make it to where they want to go. I think programs like LSU, Michigan, Florida, even Oregon, right? Those are sort of the programs that you look at and go, okay, like a lot of stuff has to go right. And a couple of injuries one way or the other can really shift things. And so,
or a lot of things don't need to go wrong.
However you'd like to phrase it. What I would say is if we look up and we're seeing a bunch of true freshmen running around and it's not the second half against the Sharks,
yes,
we're probably in some trouble when it comes to the SEC schedule. That doesn't mean one of those guys won't step in and be a major contributor. But I think we talk all the time about recruiting and how it's about stacking guys at different positions. And so if you've got a true freshman as the third guy in the stack, but he's the third guy because he's really excelled with the reps that he's gotten, that's awesome. If you have a true freshman as the second guy in the stack, he better be really, really good, right? He better have won the job,
right?
Not have gotten the job by default because you had nobody else. And
there are certain positions you can look at that. Hey, if you see a true freshman and they're out there, more likely, there are certain positions like, okay, yeah, it's because they went out there and beat guys. Like if Ben Hanks somehow comes out and he's starting corner and you got Devin Moore and Dede and Cormani, okay, he probably went and earned it. There's probably a good thing that he's out there. But like Jordan Castell a couple of seasons ago, should he really have been starting as a true freshman at safety? Probably not. But there he was, and so it happens. But going to your point there, for Florida, it's just what position are you looking at where if a freshman's making a big impact, is it because he was needed and not enough depth, or he won some competition and earned the reps?
Well, and I think that was the question coming out of spring camp and certainly fall. Florida ends up bringing in R.J. Moten from Michigan a couple of years ago. We thought he was going to be the starting safety. He was on the field on the opening throw where Utah hits the big throw for a touchdown, and all of a sudden Jordan Castell is now the guy who's back there for basically the rest of the year. Yes, right? I mean, the good news is that Florida has a lot of known entities coming back. So if you're looking at most of these positions, like I'm comfortable with Dijon Johnson and Devin Moore at corner. I'm not comfortable with the injury history of those guys, but I'm comfortable with their ability, with their level of play. So if McClain comes in and he's starting,
right,
and that moves one of those guys off the field or moves one of those guys to star, obviously that says something about what they think about Cormani McClain and his ability to contribute. Certainly as college offenses are going more and more to 4 wide and that sort of stuff, having more than 2 corners becomes important. But that would be the thing that I would say, is that if in fact we see him starting and moving one of those guys off, we should be pretty comfortable with that. And, we'll see. I mean, that's obviously why you do this. I mean, I started this whole thing talking about, as a coach, I'm always talking about practice and how it matters and how you practice is how it translates. And so, you don't just want to dismiss this stuff. At the same time, I'll believe it when the lights come on.
Spring laws, like you said. Yeah, they happen every year. All right, good stuff. We'll get this, kind of reviewing the spring storyline so far. Gators on spring break this week there, so no spring practice this week. And get back at it next week. So, Will, I know behind the scenes, one reason the spring practice, so many episodes, and I try to spend time with families, so try to get episodes recorded earlier in the day and all that stuff. But I also know Will Miles is a busy man with the Read and Reaction magazine. So, what's the update on the Read and Reaction magazine, Will?
Yeah, so it's going to be released May 6th is going to be the official release date. We'll have some stuff out there for people to pre-order. It's going to be available on Amazon again this year. We're really pushing hard this year. This is one of those where we're going for it, and so that means some advertising, that means the content, all that sort of stuff. Want to prove this out as a viable business model, and honestly, the folks at Gators Breakdown who've supported us for years and supported me for years have been a big part of leading to us believing that we can do it. So this is the year we're finally painting it off the ladder, I guess would be the politically correct way to say it. So we're going for it. There's going to be some new stuff in there this year, some of the old stuff as well, though, in terms of some film breakdowns and those sorts of things. But the whole concept is there's an article in there that I just finished up the other day talking about, is Lagway the best quarterback in the SEC, and sort of breaking down where he needs to go to improve and what we should be looking for. And obviously the season hinges on that. So he's on the cover. He's a big
everywhere.
Part of what we're doing. But I mean, look, I also finished an article the other day that I sent off to Nick that was all about the defense and how much it needed to improve, and looking at some of the stats of where Florida was. There's a big difference between going 7-5 and going 10-2. And that's a pretty big hill that Florida's trying to climb this year. And I think they have a lot of the tools to be able to make that climb, but you still got to make it. And the question is, what needs to go right in order for them to make it? And so that's some of the stuff that we're trying to address in the magazine. And then, the big thing is that we're tailoring it specifically this year to Father's Day and to fathers. So, I always put like an opening note. I've got sort of something to my dad in there, and we're going to be trying to tie in a few of those things with fathers and sons in Gator football, because obviously that's a big part of it too, is, the relationships that you build when it comes to this sort of stuff. I think folks wonder, especially as it becomes more professionalized with NIL and that sort of stuff, what's going to sort of be the glue or the fabric that holds the interest with these sorts of things. And honestly, it's going to be every year when I come back to Gainesville and get to hang out with the people that I've seen year after year after year. But it's taking my kid down to go see the game. It's going with my father, which was sort of how this whole escapade started with me getting involved in. Obviously I went to Florida, but getting really gung-ho about the Florida program was tied in with going to the games with my dad. And so, to do that to start with, and then to be able to transfer that to my kids, specifically Max, because he's the one who's really latched onto this stuff, has been a joy. And so we talk about stats, we talk about what'll happen. That's sort of my bent, and that's where I go from. But there's a little bit more schmaltzy stuff in this year's edition, talking about fathers and sons and what Gator football means. So should be cool.
Good deal. Looking forward to it, of course. Will Miles, Nick Knudsen, Read and Reaction preview season, preview magazine. So they're in May. So looking forward to it. Hopefully the spring portal doesn't throw many wrenches into the plans. Will.
Yeah, we sort of planned for that. There are sections that will remain incomplete until that portal comes around. There will be some guy who decides to leave the Florida program where we've got some sort of graphic going, "No worries, we have this backup here," and all of a sudden he won't be there. The old man yelled at the clouds is back. They're screwing up the ability to write this thing. But look, I mean, it's a fascinating time to be a Florida fan. It's a fascinating time to be somebody who's covering the program. That we're in this weird crossroads where Florida has an opportunity to really take a jump in 2025, but it's this 2-year window with Lagway. And so it's a really interesting sort of dance that they're doing. And I imagine this is a lot like watching Clemson in that Dabo Swinney era when he had Taj Boyd and was trying to get enough out of Taj Boyd to be able to make the transition to Deshaun Watson. And once he got the transition to Deshaun Watson, then it was pretty easy to make the transition to Kelly Bryant and to Trevor Lawrence. Florida, if they have to make a transition to Kelly Bryant in a couple of years without having reached the playoff, that becomes a little bit of a difficult proposition. So it's a critical juncture for the Florida program. I think the fans know that. Certainly we know that. And that's one of the things we'll be trying to highlight in the magazine is why is it a critical juncture? And then what does that really mean for what you should be looking for in 2025?
Looking forward to it, like always, right there. Read and reaction there with Will Miles. So, all right, Will, good stuff, man. That'll do it for this episode of Gators Breakdown. Getting us caught up on spring storylines right here. For Will Miles, I am David Waters, host of Gators Breakdown. You can follow me on social media at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thank you for joining us on this episode of Gators Breakdown.